Now, our 48th fact, emergent story mirrors literary improvisation. The stories that unfold during role-playing game sessions aren't written in advance. They emerge from the interaction between the game master's preparation and the player's choices. The game master might plan a scenario, but players will inevitably do something unexpected. Pursue a thread the game master mentioned offhandedly, form alliances with characters meant to be minor, or completely bypass carefully prepared encounters. This collaborative improvisation creates stories that couldn't exist in any other medium. They're too responsive, too contingent on specific decisions made in specific moments. The emergent quality gives these stories a sense of authenticity, of genuine discovery, because nobody at the table knows exactly how events will unfold. Every session is improvisation structured by rules and setting but never predetermined, always open to surprise. Our 49th fact observes that session recaps function like oral epic tradition. Many gaming groups begin each session with a recap. Someone, often the game master but sometimes a player, summarizes what happened previously. This practice serves practical purposes, helping everyone remember where things left off. But it also echoes ancient bardic traditions of oral storytelling. The recap transforms the previous session into story, selecting important moments, creating narrative through the act of retelling. Details that seemed minor in play might become central to the recap, revealing their significance in hindsight. The recap also allows the table to collaboratively remember and interpret events, sometimes discovering meanings or connections that weren't obvious during the session itself. Its history becoming legend in miniature, the raw experience of play crystallizing into narrative through the act of retelling. And finally, our 50th fact, downtime models everyday life in impossible worlds. Between adventures, characters might spend weeks or months pursuing personal projects, training new skills, crafting items, researching lore, building relationships, managing businesses, engaging with political or religious institutions. This downtime serves multiple functions. It provides pacing, giving the campaign room to breathe between intense adventures. It grounds characters in the world, showing that they have lives beyond constant danger. It allows players to pursue individual character goals without forcing the whole party to participate. And it models something often missing from fantasy fiction, the ordinary moments, the rhythm of daily life, even in worlds filled with magic and monsters. Downtime acknowledges that even legendary heroes need to eat, sleep, maintain their equipment, and occasionally just live peacefully in the worlds they're working to protect. So, as you drift deeper into relaxation, consider this. The adventures that unfold in fantasy role-playing games are dynamic, responsive, meaningful experiences that emerge from the creative space between structure and improvisation. Every session adds to a larger story, one that belongs uniquely to the people creating it together, a story that could never exist in exactly the same form anywhere else. Segment 6, Themes, Meaning, and Safe Distance. Welcome back to our continuing exploration of role-playing games. In this segment, we'll examine something profound, the way fantasy settings allow players to engage with serious themes, difficult topics, and meaningful questions while maintaining a safe emotional distance that makes exploration possible. Our 51st fact reveals that fantasy politics create safe distance from real issues. When a campaign involves tensions between an oppressive empire and independence-seeking provinces, players can explore themes of colonialism, resistance, and sovereignty without the conversation becoming about specific real-world conflicts. The fantasy frame allows engagement with political themes, corruption, revolution, the balance between security and freedom, the legitimacy of different forms of government, without triggering the defensive reactions that direct discussion of contemporary politics might provoke. Players can examine different perspectives, experiment with solutions, explore consequences, all within a context that feels removed enough from reality to permit genuine curiosity and open-minded exploration. The distance doesn't make the themes less meaningful, it makes them more approachable, more discussable, safer to examine honestly. Now, our 50-second fact. Magic versus technology tensions create rich plots. Many fantasy settings include conflicts between magical traditions and emerging technological advancement. the old ways versus the new, mysticism versus rationalism, nature versus industry. These tensions generate compelling drama. They're not just about which side is right, they're about change itself, about what's lost and gained when societies transform, about tradition and progress, and whether these must always be in opposition. A campaign exploring these themes might involve preventing a magical catastrophe caused by industrial pollution, or protecting a community of inventors from traditionalist magic users who fear change, or trying to find synthesis between two seemingly incompatible worldviews. These plots work on multiple levels, as straightforward adventure as character drama, and as metaphor for real tensions about technology, modernization, and cultural change. Our 53rd fact connects escapism and agency to emotional investment. Fantasy role-playing games offer escape from daily life, from constraints and responsibilities that might feel overwhelming. But this escapism isn't passive like watching television. It's active. Players make meaningful choices, solve problems, overcome obstacles. They have agency in the fantasy world in ways they might not in their ordinary lives. This combination, escape with agency, creates deep emotional investment. Players care about their characters and the world because they're actively shaping both through their decisions. The escape isn't from responsibility, it's into a different kind of responsibility, one chosen freely, one where effort produces visible results, where individual actions genuinely matter. This makes the fantasy world emotionally real despite being imaginatively constructed, creating experiences that feel meaningful and rewarding. Now, we arrive at our 54th fact. Weather and seasons add emotional texture. The best game masters use environmental details to reinforce mood and theme. A tense negotiation might occur during a thunderstorm, rain hammering against windows, lightning punctuating important moments. A long journey might span seasons, beginning in comfortable autumn, growing harsher through winter, emerging into spring just as the party achieves their goal. A cursed land might experience eternal autumn, leaves falling constantly but never fully stripped from trees, suggesting stagnation and decay. Weather and seasons aren't just atmospheric details, they're emotional cues that prime players to feel certain ways about scenes and situations. They add texture to memory, helping players remember not just what happened, but how it felt. The cold, the rain, the oppressive heat, the blessed relief of gentle weather after harsh conditions. Our 55th fact explores how language and naming shape tone and expectations. The names used for places, people, and objects in a fantasy setting communicate volumes about tone. Harsh consonant-heavy names suggest rough, dangerous cultures. Flowing, melodious names imply refinement or otherworldliness. Silly names signal that this campaign welcomes humor. Ominous names like the Dread Wastes or the Forsaken immediately establish emotional expectations. Language choices matter too, whether non-player characters speak in formal, archaic patterns or casual contemporary language, whether magic uses Latin-inspired words or completely invented terminology. These decisions aren't just aesthetic, they set the tone for the entire campaign, signaling to players what kind of experience they're in for, whether to approach situations with gravity or levity, whether this world is familiar or genuinely alien. Our 56 fact notes that safety tools reshape how dark fantasy is handled. Modern gaming culture has developed various safety tools, Session Zero discussions about boundaries, X cards that allow anyone to veto content, lines and veils that distinguish between topics to avoid entirely versus topics to acknowledge, but not detail explicitly. These tools acknowledge that fantasy can explore dark themes, horror, tragedy, violence, loss, but must do so consensually, respecting the comfort and well-being of everyone at the table. Safety tools don't prevent serious themes, they enable them by creating trust. When players know they can stop content that becomes genuinely distressing, they're more willing to explore difficult territory because they have control over their experience. This paradoxically allows for darker, more mature fantasy than might otherwise be possible, because everyone knows the boundaries are negotiable and respected. Now, Our 57th fact: fantasy supports exploration of power and responsibility. Many fantasy campaigns involve characters gaining significant power, magical abilities, political influence, legendary reputations. This creates natural opportunities to explore questions about power. How should it be used? When does protection become control? How do you balance your own goals against responsibilities to others? What corrupts and why? Characters who become powerful must decide what kind of powerful people they'll be. These aren't abstract philosophical questions, they're immediate, practical dilemmas that emerge from gameplay. Should you use that devastating spell knowing it will cause collateral damage? Should you accept a position of authority, even though it will limit your freedom? Fantasy makes these questions concrete, embodied, felt rather than merely discussed. Our 58th fact observes that moral ambiguity is easier to explore in fantasy frames. Real-world moral discussions often come with heavy baggage, political affiliations, personal stakes, cultural assumptions that make productive conversation difficult. Fantasy allows similar discussions without that baggage. Is it acceptable to kill sentient creatures that are naturally evil? Can redemption come after terrible acts? When does the need for order justify limiting freedom? These questions have real-world analogs, but the fantasy framing creates psychological distance that permits exploration without triggering defensive reactions. Players can examine different positions, argue various perspectives, change their minds, all within a space that feels safe precisely because it's imaginary. The insights gained often transfer back to real-world thinking, but the fantasy frame makes the exploration itself possible. Now, our 59th fact: shared imagination distributes authorship. Role-playing games don't have a single author. The game master contributes the world and situations, but each player authors their character's choices, dialogue, and development. The story that emerges belongs to everyone collaboratively. This distributed authorship creates investment. Everyone has ownership over the narrative. It also creates surprises even for the game master as players take the world in unexpected directions. Shared imagination means no single person controls the story, which can be challenging but also incredibly rewarding. The best moments often emerge from the creative friction between different imaginations working together, from the space between what was planned and what actually happens when players engage with those plans. And finally, our 60th fact: fantasy enables low-stakes ethical experimentation. In the real world, ethical mistakes can have serious, irreversible consequences. In fantasy games, players can explore different moral frameworks, try on various ethical positions, see how different approaches play out, all without real-world harm. Want to try playing a character with a rigid code of honor to see how that feels, how it constrains and empowers? You can. Want to explore the perspective of someone from a radically different culture with different values? You can. Want to see what happens if you make the selfish choice or the self-sacrificing choice or the pragmatic choice? You can. Fantasy provides a laboratory for moral experimentation where the stakes feel meaningful because you're invested in the characters and world, but where mistakes don't cause actual harm to real people. This safe space for experimentation can build ethical muscles, expanding moral imagination in ways that transfer to real-world thinking and decision-making. So, as you continue relaxing, breathing slowly, letting tension drain away, think about this. Fantasy role-playing games handle heavy topics, well, precisely because they're fantasy. The distance from reality creates safety. The safety creates permission to explore. And the exploration, guided by rules, supported by shared imagination, grounded in collaborative storytelling, creates experiences that feel meaningful despite being, or perhaps because of being, fundamentally imaginary. Segment 7: Culture, Influence, and Feedback Loops. Let's continue our relaxing journey through the world of role-playing games. In this segment, we'll zoom out from individual gaming tables to look at the broader cultural landscape, how fantasy RPGs shape and are shaped by the wider world of media, fiction, and creative culture. Our 61st fact observes that D&D's success reshaped the fantasy market. Dungeons & Dragons, the first widely popular role-playing game, didn't just create a new hobby, it transformed the fantasy genre itself. Publishers noticed that D&D players wanted more fantasy content, which led to increased publication of fantasy novels, art books, miniatures, and related merchandise. The specific flavor of fantasy that D&D emphasized, adventuring parties, dungeon exploration, magic systems with defined spell lists, distinct character classes, became enormously influential. Fantasy novels began incorporating these elements, recognizing that readers familiar with D&D would immediately understand references to clerics and paladins, to different schools of magic, to the ecology of dungeons. The game's commercial success created market incentives that shaped what kinds of fantasy got published, what themes became prominent, what tropes became standard. One game's popularity rippled outward, reshaping an entire genre. Now, our 60-second fact. Fantasy dominates public perception of RPGs. When most people hear role-playing game, they immediately think of fantasy settings, swords, magic, dragons, dungeons. This association is so strong that games set in other genres often define themselves in opposition to fantasy. It's like D&D, but in space, or it's an RPG set in the modern world instead of a fantasy realm. Fantasy isn't just one option among many, it's become the default, the assumed setting, the baseline from which other RPGs diverge. This dominance shapes how the entire hobby is perceived, understood, and marketed. It influences what new players expect when they first encounter role-playing games, what resources are most readily available, what conventions and communities form around the hobby. Our 63rd fact notes that market dominance keeps fantasy front and center. Because fantasy RPGs sell better than other genres, publishers invest more resources in them. This creates more fantasy content, rulebooks, adventures, sourcebooks, miniatures, accessories. The abundance of fantasy material makes it easier for players to find resources, which attracts more players to fantasy games, which increases sales, which justifies more investment. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. This doesn't mean other genres can't succeed, but they face steeper challenges. Fantasy's market dominance is both cause and effect. It's popular because there's so much support, and there's so much support because it's popular. This feedback loop has kept fantasy at the center of role-playing game culture for decades. Our 64th fact explores how cross-media influence keeps expectations aligned. Fantasy RPGs don't exist in isolation. They're part of a broader fantasy media ecosystem that includes novels, films, television shows, video games, comic books, and more. These different media influence each other constantly. A fantasy film introduces visual designs that game masters incorporate into their descriptions. A popular RPG sourcebook inspires a novelist's world building. A video game's mechanical systems influence tabletop game design. This cross-pollination keeps fantasy expectations relatively consistent across media. When players imagine a dragon, they're drawing on images from films, illustrations from books, designs from video games, and their own experiences at gaming tables. All these sources blend together, creating a shared cultural understanding of what fantasy looks like, sounds like, feels like. Now we arrive at our 65th fact. Actual play shows reinforce fantasy norms. In recent years, streaming shows where groups play role-playing games have become enormously popular. Shows like Critical Role, Dimension 20, and countless others allow audiences to watch actual gameplay sessions. These shows predominantly feature fantasy settings, which reinforces fantasy's association with the hobby. They also demonstrate specific play styles, problem-solving approaches, and social dynamics that viewers often try to replicate at their own tables. Actual play shows have become incredibly influential, teaching new players how to play, setting expectations for what games should feel like, popularizing certain approaches to storytelling and character development. Because most successful actual play shows use fantasy settings, they strengthen fantasy's position as the default genre for role-playing games. Our 66th fact celebrates fan remix culture that keeps tropes evolving. Fantasy RPG fans don't just consume content, they create it. They write homebrew adventures and design custom character options. They draw fan art and compose music, They share house rules and world-building ideas. This constant creative activity remixes existing tropes, combining them in new ways, adding fresh perspectives, slowly evolving the genre. A fan might combine standard elves with Polynesian cultural influences, creating something familiar yet novel. Another might reimagine undead as tragic rather than evil, shifting the emotional weight of encounters with such creatures. This grassroots creativity ensures that fantasy doesn't stagnate. The tropes remain recognizable, providing continuity and shared language, but they're constantly being reinterpreted, renovated, seen from new angles. Fan remix culture is the engine that keeps fantasy feeling fresh despite its reliance on established conventions.